Okay, so good morning, all, and glad that a couple of us are here for Torah Study Live. Um, I wanted to, before we get into Torah study, I just want to remark on for a moment about what day today is in the Jewish calendar. Today is Hoshana Rabbah. That's what it's called, the Great Hoshana. Every day of the holiday of Sukkot, we take the lulav and etrog in our hand, and at a point in the service, depending on our custom, either after Hallel or after Musaf, we march around the synagogue and onto the bima while a Torah is taken out of the ark to remind ourselves of what was done when the temple was standing in Jerusalem, that people with lulav and etrog would do the same thing. It would be quite the procession, and there are prayers recited all each day. Like there's a prayer that is an alphabetical acrostic, and after each phrase for each letter of the alphabet, we say Hoshana, which in English is Hosanna, and which means save us. So the idea behind the prayer is to both physically by walking with the lulav and etrog, and spiritually by praying. We're focusing on the theme of the season, which is this transition between joy for the bounty of the harvest and anxiety about what the winter rainy season will bring. So asking God to save us and provide rain for the coming season at the right time. So Hoshana Rabbah is, as Hoshana, the regular Hoshana, exaggerated by doing it 7 times. So there are 7 circlings and 7 prayers, 7 alphabetical acrostics, and then we take willow branches and we beat the willow branches as a last-ditch effort to ask God to forgive our sins. So we think that the book of life, or the book that God records our names in, is sealed at the end of Yom Kippur, but actually it's another week, another 12 days that it's open until today. Hoshana Rabbah, last chance. So we have Tashlich to throw crumbs to get rid of sins, and we have Hoshana Rabbah, willow branches, beating them, and the leaves fall off to also represent asking God to forgive our sins. And the whole service ends with this prayer: may it be your will, Adonai, our God and God of our ancestors, to accept our prayers and our ritual of this morning with compassion. Remove the barriers that separate us from you. Hear our plea and seal us in the book of a good life. Amen. So that's the end of the Hoshana Rabbah service, and we have 2 more services, 2 more holy days, Shmini Atzeret, tonight and tomorrow, which is a Yom Tov in its own right. That is, it's a separate holiday from Sukkot. So therefore, when lighting the holiday candles tonight, we say Shehechianu, and it's Yom HaShmini Chag HaAtzeret Hazeh. And then Simchat Torah is an extra day of Shmini Atzeret. In Israel, Shmini Atzeret and Simchat Torah are the same day, and that's the yard site actually on a Jewish calendar of October 7th. October 7th last year was on Shmini Atzeret Simchat Torah in Israel. We observed October 7th on the secular calendar, as did Israel, and they're going to be observing the yard site probably on Sunday, and maybe that will be the case going forward, to observe the yard site of October 7th on the Jewish calendar day as opposed to the secular calendar day. And so tomorrow, Thursday evening is Simchat Torah, Friday is Simchat Torah, And then the holiday is over when we light Shabbos candles. So it's actually over an hour earlier than usual because Yom Tov going into Shabbat, you can't light the Shabbat candles when it's dark. You can only light Shabbat candles when it's sunset. So a little bit before 6 o'clock on Friday evening is when Shabbat begins, and it's a regular Shabbat. But we don't recite Kabbalat Shabbat because it's Yom Tov going into Shabbat. Anyway, so it makes for complicated holidays and being in outside of Israel. So Friday in Israel is a regular weekday. But here and any Jewish place outside of Israel, you have 3 days in a row. People call it a 3-day Yom Tov because you got Thursday, Friday leading into Shabbat. So 3 days in a row of not being able to do work or anything like that. So anyway, we on Simchat Torah, we conclude reading the Torah and start the Torah all over again. And the way we do it here at Shul is we used to unroll the Torah all around the sanctuary. Now we do it laying it across a lot of tables. It's safer that way, and it doesn't require so many people to hold up the Torah while we do it. So that's how we get from the end back to the beginning again. Rolling out the Torah that way. So it makes it very interesting also to see what the Torah looks like and how beautiful it is. And so Shabbat then, so we read a little bit from the beginning, like the whole creation story of chapter 1 leading into Shabbat, which is the start of chapter 2. And then on Shabbat, we read the portion Bereisheet. So beginning the cycle once again. So I want us to look today in the Eitz Chaim, beginning on page 17. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Whatever edition of Chumash you have, turn to Genesis chapter 3. But we're actually, the way our editors of Eitz Chaim did this, it makes it seem as if chapter 3 really begins with chapter 2, verse 25. It does make sense from context, so we will start there. Chapter 2, verse 25, but where in the English it looks like it's all around that big number 3, or the big letter Gimel. Okay, so I want to read this story, which is of Adam and Eve and the snake. So there's a lot to talk about with the first portion. In fact, it could be a whole semester of study about biblical mythology or Jewish mythology, comparing our story to Greek mythology, to ancient Middle Eastern mythological stories, which are the area is known as Sumeria or Mesopotamia. So the Sumerian creation myths, we have a story, and next week's portion is Noah. We have the story there. In that version, in the Sumerian version, Noah is Utnapishtim. So we laugh at some of the names. I can't tell you linguistically what that name means, but there's lots of flood stories all around the world that are part of ancient myth, which is fascinating in and of itself. And all of them have a different kind of take on why the flood is brought and how the person or family is saved, and then what happens after they're saved. So it's just interesting. If you just Google Utnapishtim, U-T-N-A, Utna, P-I-S-H-T-I-M, just on your own, just want to Google Utnapishtim, you'd find a fascinating flood story in the ancient Sumerian myth. Anyway, creation myths are fascinating too. And especially then, if we read our story. Now, let me just step back for a second. I have no problem calling the first 11 chapters of the Torah our creation myth. In that, myth makes it seem as if it's fake. It's an ancient story told and retold. It's kind of like what would be a definition of the myth. I have no problem referring to the 11 chapters of the Torah as myth. In fact, I don't have a problem calling all of the narrative in the Torah as myth as well, because my understanding of Torah and God, which I've said many times in this class and in other classes and contexts as well, is I don't believe that God handed this Torah, this Chumash as printed here, to Moses at Mount Sinai. I just don't believe that. And what I do believe, because this is my understanding of Judaism, what it means to me to be a rabbi of the conservative movement of Judaism, is that this is an ancient text. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying it's not ancient. It is an ancient text. I just don't think it's given by God to Moses at Mount Sinai. I do believe that it is stories that have been part of our tradition that perceive as if God gave the story to Mount Sinai. In other words, it's a perception of the world around us, and understand a sense of trying to understand how the world came into being, how all people in the world got here, and who are we as the people of Israel, and what is our relationship to God. So we understand that God exists, and this story, and the story assumes God exists already. It doesn't tell us how God was created. Other myths tell us how the gods were created. But our story starts with the premise that God's already there. So that's a major contrast between our story and stories of other people's, origin stories of other people. So we know that God is there, but we don't know where God came from. And so the description of the creation of the world is therefore an understanding of the world around us and how it might have come into being by God. It's not a scientific description. We should not understand this. Chapter 1, which we're not going to look at today, don't understand. Everybody in the non-Orthodox world understands that chapter 1 of Genesis is not meant to be science. And it's not a problem for us to say that it's not science. And so it's not a problem for a religious Jew to be a paleontologist. Even though there are no dinosaurs listed in chapter 1, it's not a problem to say that dinosaurs existed. That's not a problem. It's not a problem also to understand that there were Neanderthals who roamed the earth, who are related to Homo sapiens, but are genetically different, a different species. So it's not a problem at all, because I understand, and most non-Orthodox Jews understand, that this is not science. It's a perception, an outlook on how we got here and what we're supposed to do with the knowledge that we got here with God's help. Okay, that's what the Torah is all about. That's what it means to be Jewish. To understand that we have an obligation to act and behave a certain way, knowing that God exists. Okay? So, the process of becoming aware of these things is what we read about in the first chapters of Genesis. Okay? So, Adam's created. Right? In chapter 1, it's kind of weird how it's presented. Zachar unekeva bara otam. Male and female, God created them. Okay, but we don't know how. It just seems, was it one person that had male and female form? It's unclear from the Hebrew text. Just take a look at that on the sixth day about the description of that in chapter 1. Chapter 2 is a different description of the very same thing. And the order is presented a little bit differently as well. And in chapter 2 is the story of God creating man, Adam, and then recognizing, actually on page 16, that it's not good for Adam to be alone. And so God put him to sleep, took one of his ribs, and created woman, Eve, from that rib. Okay, so that famous story is chapter 2. Okay, it doesn't happen that way in chapter 1. So that's interesting too, that there are different stories. And that just adds to my understanding, makes it harder to accept if God wrote the Torah and gave it to Moses, why did God write two different versions of the creation story? But if we understand that this is a combination of different oral traditions coming edited in the Chumash, in the Torah as we know it, then it's not a problem. You have one version that's chapter 1, another version is chapter 2, and remnants of another version, which has Leviathan and other sea monsters and sea creatures that are referenced in Psalms and in Job and in a couple of the prophets too. So you don't have Leviathan or other sea creatures like that mentioned in chapter 1 or chapter 2, but you have it, like I said, scattered throughout Psalms, Job, and other places in the Bible. So, okay, so man and woman are created, and then we come to verse 25 in chapter 2. Okay, Vayihiyu Shnehem. So we're on the bottom of page 17 in the Eitz Chaim. Vayihiyu Shnehem Arumim, Ha'adam ve'ishto, Velo yitbo shashu. So the two of them were naked, the man and his woman. Well, it says here his wife, but more literally his woman. Because it just to understand, man and his wife assumes that they were married, right? So we take it for granted and just keep on reading because that's how we understand Adam and Eve. But if you understand the story, there's no such thing as marriage. It's just the two of them. When did marriage happen? Marriage happened when the Torah talks about that later in the book of Leviticus, who were allowed to have relations with, who were allowed to marry. So that's not, and we have stories of Abraham and Sarah, right? So we have from Adam and Eve on generations of people, right? So, but at this point, there's nothing about marriage. So it's not quite right to say the man and his wife in the translation. It's the man and his woman. And you can literally translate it that way, as sexist as it is, because of the story a few verses before of how this woman was created from his rib. So it is his woman, because she's created from his body, literally. So the two of them were naked, the man and his woman, and they were not ashamed, or they felt no shame. Now, it's important, I think, and the editors did this on purpose, that the story begins with this line, because we're going to see a line like this that comes at the end of the story. All right, so just keep that in mind, that verse 25 is important to start the story with this line. So it serves as a frame. So frame number 1, part 1 of the frame is this: the two of them were naked, the man and his woman, and they were not ashamed, or they felt no shame. Chapter 3, verse 1. V'hanachash haya arum mikol chayat hasadeh asher asa Adonai Elohim vayomer el ha'isha af ki amar Elohim lo tochlu mikol eitz hagan. And the snake, it says here the serpent, was shrewdest of all wild beasts. We just had the word arumim, the plural. There it's naked in 25. Why is arum, the singular, translated as shrewd? The snake was naked from all the animals of the field. So how does that mean? I mean, all the animals are naked, right? But animals in the field have some kind of fur. Okay, now they're still naked, but they have fur on their skin. Snakes don't have anything on their skin, they're just skin. Okay, so again, the translation is adding something to the story. It's an interpretation. Already telling us in the translation, this snake is shrewd. But we don't know the snake is shrewd yet. Well, and then the snake talks. Okay, so that's bizarre, right? A talking snake. Where's that coming from? None of the animals that were created before talked. Maybe they talked also, but they didn't say anything significant to write a story about. Here, this is the first significant thing that an animal says, so the snake is talking here. So are we to assume that other animals talked at the time? So again, this is the problem, or the challenge. If we take this story literally, because God wrote it, how could it not be true? Well, snakes don't talk today. Why did this snake talk then? And how do we make sense of it? So that's why you need the midrash to kind of make sense that the snake, or what it says here below the line and on the next page, really, with the whole introduction to this below the line, is that the snake is serves as a kind of angel. That it's like the donkey that Bilam rode that talked to Bilam in the book of Numbers. So you had a talking donkey, and here we have a talking snake serving God's purpose to teach people a lesson. Okay, that's how the best you can do with it when you are taking the Torah literally. But if you see it as a story, it's a story, and it's serving a purpose. It's like the rabbis in their midrash have animals talking all the time, have mountains talking, for example, why did Noah choose the dove of all the birds to go forth to see if it's safe to leave the ark yet? Well, all the other animals came to Noah, according to the midrash, and said why Noah should pick them. Okay, so you have talking animals in the midrash. So the midrash, the rabbis don't have a problem coming up with stories, lots of stories about animals talking, and trees talk, and mountains talk, etc. So I see this as another midrash. It's in the Torah to teach us a lesson. Okay, so we're not supposed to take this literally. So the snake was more naked from all the animals of the field that God had made, that God, Adonai Elohim, that God made. So another thing, Elohim is God's name in chapter 1. Adonai Elohim is God's name in chapter 2 and chapter 3. So that's different also. And so the snake said to the woman, did God really say you shall not eat of any tree in the garden? Verse 2. Vatamer ha'isha el hanachash, mipri eitz hagan nochel. The woman said to the snake, from the fruit of the trees of the garden we can eat. 3. Mipri ha'etz. Now here we have to understand, the letter vav usually is translated as and, but sometimes the letter vav means but. And here it means but. Mipri ha'etz asher betoch hagan, amar Elohim lo tochlu mimenu, velo tig'u bo pen temutun. But from the tree that is in the middle of the garden, or in the midst of the garden, it's translated as the middle. Again, with the translation, it adds something that's not necessarily there in the text itself. The tree in the midst of the garden, God said Elohim. The woman refers to God as Elohim. Our text says Adonai Elohim. So in verse 1. In verse 2, the woman is referring to God as Elohim. I don't know if that makes a difference. It's just interesting. So she says to the snake, and how does she know God's name, by the way? We don't know how she knows God's name. She's quoting, this is a quote. Verse 2 and 3 is a quote, quoting Eve directly. She says, the woman says to the snake, quote, from the fruit of the garden we can eat, but from the fruit that is in the midst of the garden, God, Elohim, said, don't eat from it and don't touch it, lest we die. Now, God did say to them, don't eat of this tree. God did not say, don't touch it. So she's adding something to it, and she also knows God's name. So I think it's just something worth thinking about. How does Eve know God's name? She is the first person in the Torah, chapter 3, the first person to call God by name. And just to assume that God, the narrative already assumes God exists. Bereisheet bara Elohim. In the beginning, when God created, right? So it assumes Elohim exists. So maybe Adam and Eve had some kind of encounter that's not listed here, where God introduces God's self to them. So we don't know. But we should just don't take this for granted that she knew God's name, because we know God's name. Okay? So she adds, yes, go ahead, Gabe.
I guess it's verse 3. It says, lest you die.
Yes, that was, she's quoting God talking to her.
Oh, okay. I thought in the Hebrew it said we.
No, temutun is you shall die. So like it's a quote within a quote. She's talking, and within her talking, she says, God said, don't touch this tree and don't eat from it, lest you, plural, it's a you plural, die. Okay, so again, she's just adding, God did not say don't touch it. God did say don't eat from it. So if you look back at chapter 2, that's what it says. Verse 4, Vayomer hanachash el ha'isha lo mot temutun. The snake says to the woman, you won't die. You won't surely die. 5, Ki yodea Elohim, ki biyom achalchem mimenu, v'nifkechu einechem, v'yitem ke Elohim, yodei tov v'ra. So it's verse 5 is continuation what the snake is saying. Snake says, you won't die because God knows that on the day you eat from it, your eyes will be opened, but in a way, so it's not a literal opening. So liftoach is to open, and that is to physically like open a window or open a door. But nifkechu, pei kufchet, is an opening that means perception or understanding. Okay, so your eyes opening in that way is like an aha, like understanding, a perception. So it's more than just you open your eyes and in the morning when you wake up and you see that it's, and you take a look at the clock and see what time it is. That's an opening of the eyes. This opening of the eyes is more of a deeper sense of understanding. So God knows that on the day that you eat from it, that tree, that your eyes will be aware, that you'll have some kind of knowledge, and you will be like God in that you will know the difference. Not the difference. You will know good and bad. Okay, so in other words, Adam and Eve don't know good and bad now. So the purpose of this story is to provide an understanding of how human beings know the difference between good and bad. Animals know the difference between what instinctively they can do and they shouldn't do. Okay? Animals know where, like, whether they can swim or they can't swim, or they can Stay away from a lion or not worry about a lion. All depends what kind of animal it is. So things like that, animals know. But the good and bad, like a consciousness of morality, human beings have that. So how do we, as human beings, how did we get that knowledge of good and bad? Are we born with it? Or is it because we ate? Because Eve and Adam ate from the tree of good and evil, knowledge of good and evil. So that's how the story, this is the myth that explains how human beings of all creatures on earth know the difference between good and evil. That we have as an ethical and moral sense. Okay? So it just comes in a quaint story, right? It's more interesting to have a story like this of a talking snake and Adam and Eve, and like the tension between the Adam and Eve and this animal, kind of like this three-way kind of tension here, because we'll see what happens. Each blames the other for eating the fruit. So that gets to also, just a lot about this story is here in a beautiful short narrative, and the difference between our narrative and myth is really in how many pages or chapters. You read the Iliad and the Odyssey. Those are huge books. Or other stories of Greek mythology, they go on and on and on. And the Sumerian myths go on and on and on. Here, we just have 11 chapters, which is a whole creation story and a whole origin story before we get to Abraham and Sarah. Once we get to Abraham and Sarah in chapter 12 of Genesis, then the Jewish story begins. So the pre-Jewish story is the first 11, so just 11 chapters. That's all we have left. Maybe there were other sources out there, but we don't know. Okay, so the snake. So this is why, according to Midrash, the snake is serving as a tool of God. That God put the tree in the garden on purpose for the snake then to get Eve and then Adam to eat from it. Right? Because get to the story, like why should there have been a problem with this tree to begin with? Why did God have to put the tree in the garden? If God didn't want us to eat from it, God shouldn't have put the tree there. So clearly God wants people to eat from the tree, but it's written in such a way that it's our fault for eating from it, and it's the snake's fault too. So, so we could go on and on and on about that. And then also just how the Christians understand this too, about original sin. This is a whole story about original sin and the fall of humanity, right? But this, as the below the line on page 18, which you can read on your own, talks about this from the Jewish perspective, has nothing to do with original sin. And it's not even described as a sin. And also, God takes care of the people at the end of the story by showing them the fig tree so that they can, so he helps them make clothes. So if God didn't like what they did, God wouldn't have been compassionate toward them and helping them to make clothes. Okay, so let's yes, go ahead, Sumner.
Uh, it's interesting to me that he had the serpent talking to the woman. Why didn't he talk? Why didn't
Right, that's a good question too. Why not talk? Right, if the Torah and Jewish tradition is male oriented, why is the snake talking to the woman, the unnamed woman at this point? Because Adam could be person, male person, or it could be his name, Adam, where the woman is not named yet, or maybe she was named in, just a second. No, she's not named Chava yet. Right, because Adam names all the animals, but he hasn't named the woman yet. So she's yet unnamed. So that's an interesting question, a valid question, Sumner, and I don't have an answer for it. But it's another question we ask about the story. Okay, and there would be male-oriented commentators that would say, well, this just shows the nature of woman, that the woman is easily tempted, and then also blames the snake for eating the fruit, and then the man blames the woman for eating the fruit. So anyway, it can be used by sexist commentators afterward about how she conducts herself, and that's just typical of women today. Okay, I'm not saying that myself. I'm just saying that's what the commentators say. Okay, so 6, Vatera ha'isha kitov ha'etz lama'achal, v'chi ta'avahu le'enayim, v'nechmad ha'etz lahaskil, v'tikach mipirio v'tochal, v'titein gam le'isha, with a dot in the hay. So the dot in the hay of isha makes this a possessive form. So isha without a dot in the hay means woman. Isha with a dot in the hay technically supposed to be pronounced isha with a little extra breath at the end, which means her man, okay, or her husband. Vatitein gam le'isha ima, also a dot in the hay, with her, vayochal. So the woman saw that the tree was good to eat from, but she didn't know it yet, but it looked like it would be good, and that it was desirable to the eyes, like it looked good. The tree looked good, looked like it could be tasty, and that the tree was lovely to learn from. That the tree was desirable as a source of wisdom, which is a bizarre thing to describe about a tree. Like, is there any food from which we're supposed to gain knowledge? Like, carrots are good for your eyes, but what's good for brain health? I don't know, doing crossword puzzles is supposed to be good for your brain, but what kind of food is good for your brain? I don't remember offhand, but there could be some foods out there that are good for your brain health. But are certain fruit good for your brain? I can't think of a fruit offhand that's supposed to be good but that's what the woman is perceiving here, that the tree is, so that the tree it would be tasty, it looks good, and that it would be a good source of knowledge. So she took from its fruit and ate, and gave to her man with her, and he ate. Now, so she gave to the man with her, and he ate. Now, does that mean he was there the whole time while the snake was talking? Or did she walk somehow to give it to him? We don't know. That it implies in verse 6 that he's there just silent. So snake is talking to me, I'm the woman. I see the tree, I take from the fruit, I eat from it, and I give to my mate who's right here. Does this imply that there was walking involved? Was the snake in the tree? Was the snake below the tree? Was the snake in the tree itself, from the very tree that we're talking about not eating? We don't know. We don't know the logistics here. It leaves a lot to an imagination about how exactly, like if this were now, if somebody were to put this story on as a play, you'd have a lot of gaps to fill in here. And the ways somebody would present it could be legitimate, but we don't actually know how it plays out. We don't know if the man was with her this whole time, or at the time that she ate it, he was with her. He could have said to her, "Don't eat it. God said not to eat it. You shouldn't eat it." But he's not saying that. She's eating from it, and she gives it to him to eat, and he eats. No question on his part. No comment about it. He just eats. Now, is this another sexist thing? Husbands always eat what wives put in front of them? I don't know. I don't know. But again, it's something to think about what the Adam's role was in this story here. Now, 7, Vatipakachna einei shnehem, that snake would say this would happen if you eat from it. He said that God knew that their eyes would be opened in this way. So, Vatipakachna einei shnehem, and their eyes were opened in this way. That word, pei kuf chet, opening with understanding and perception. So their eyes perceived, vayedu ki erumim heim, and they knew that they were naked. This is why this here is important. That we have verse 25 back on 17. We were told, if you look back on 25, the narrative tells us that they were naked. Now, in verse 7, their eyes opened with understanding and they knew that they were naked. Okay? They didn't know they were naked before. The narrative tells us they were naked. They didn't know. This is just the way they were. Now they knew they were naked. In other words, they knew by eating from the tree that there are certain things that people do in public, even though they're the only two people. There's no public. There's animals. It's only the two of them, so who cares? But they knew that there's something wrong with walking around naked. It's just something you don't do. Okay, how did they know that? Well, the tree taught them that. The fruit of the tree taught them that. So their eyes opened with understanding. They knew they were naked. Vayit peru ale te'ena. And they sewed fig leaves, vaya'asu lahem chagarot. And they made, well, usually it would be translated as belts. So it's translated here as loincloths. So all I would say is, you could make a belt out of a fig leaf, but chagara has to mean something else, and we're not sure. So the English translation says loincloths. But again, so for the woman, did she only make a loincloth, or did she make something for her chest too? We don't know. So does chagara mean something else? Like a fig leaf, if you could picture a fig leaf, it's pretty big. And if you sewed fig leaves together, you could make something out of it. And so it could be a garment that could cover your whole front. So I don't know. It's a question. And we also don't know, by the way, what fruit this is. So since they're taking fig leaves, there are some who say it was the fig that they ate. Now, the tradition that it's an apple, where does that come from? So the apple could be from the Middle Ages, when art in art, this is depicted by Renaissance art. And what fruit is common in medieval Europe? An apple. You're not going to have figs. Figs do grow in Spain and Italy and Greece. But the first medieval artwork could be from Italy, but it's not a fig, it's an apple. So I'm just saying the name of the fruit is not listed here. So we should not assume it's an apple. This assumption we can make from the story because of verse 7 of the fig leaves that they are using to sew these garments. That's a safer assumption that it's a fig rather than some other kind of fruit. Now, apples do grow in the Middle East, but I'm not sure if apples are native to the Middle East. So the likelihood of it actually have been an apple is pretty low. So if we think of other fruits from that time, it could be a date, it could be a fig, it could be a pomegranate. Those are three common fruits, and those are among the 3 of the 7 types of agriculture grown in the land of Israel that a special bracha is said over. Eretz chita usaora, so wheat and barley. a vine. It could be grape and olive. So grape, olive, pomegranate, and date and fig. And there's also, well, date is part of it because the honey, that's eretz zeit shemen udavash, olive oil and honey. The honey in that verse in the book of Numbers, which describes the 7 things that the land of Israel is known for, is date honey, not honey from bees. So those are the possible fruits that are native to the Middle East. Apples, it's really unclear. So now, let's read on a little bit more in the story, and then understanding how the continuation adds to the myth and what we're supposed to learn from the story. Vayishmeu. Okay, so they're aware now that they're naked. They make clothes, and then verse 8. Excuse me. Vayishmeu et kol Adonai Elohim mithalech bagan leruach hayom. Vayitchabei ha'adam ve'ishto mipnei Adonai Elohim betoch eitz hagan. It's a fascinating verse. They heard the sound of Adonai Elohim walking in the garden. Okay, it's bizarre. Do we know that God walks? Does God have a human form? So the sound of God, what it says here, moving about. So because the mitalech is an unusual form of the verb. Halach means to walk or to go. So the sound of God going in the garden, what does that mean? God, if God is abstract, God doesn't move about in a garden. So, okay, so what is this some unusual perception that they have, that both of them have, because it's written in the plural. They heard. It doesn't say vayishma, he heard, or vatishma, she heard. Vayishmeu, they heard. They heard the sound of Adonai Elohim moving, walking in the garden, leruach hayom, meaning at the windy time of the day, or the breezy time of the day. In the Middle East, is that toward evening when it gets cooler? Maybe. Is it in the morning? Don't know what time of day this is. At the windy part of the day. And the man, it says, interesting, it says it in the singular. The man hid. Vayitchabei. It should be, so vayishmeu is plural, they heard. Vayitchabei means he hid. It should be vayitchabu, that they hid. So they heard, but he hid. But it says the man and his woman hid. So that the verb doesn't match the man and the woman. It should be vayitchabu. So I'm just saying, I'm pointing out, did originally the man hide? And maybe the editor of the story said, that doesn't look good. We got to make man and woman hide, but we'll retain the original verb, which was the singular. Just interesting. So they were hiding. So they heard God moving about. And what did they do in response? They hid from before God, Adonai Elohim, among the trees of the garden. Or that the singular tree. Okay? Vayikra Adonai Elohim El Ha'adam. See, the singular. So it's Vayishmeu, they heard, he hid, and so God, Adonai Elohim called to Adam, Vayomer lo Ayeka, and said to him, where are you? That's this also. We could say a lot about that word, Ayeka. Where are you? And spiritually, philosophically, it's a really important question. But I'm not getting into all the philosophy and spirituality behind it. About the story, if it's the two of them, why is God only talking to one of them? They heard the sound of God moving. He hid, even though it says Adam and the woman hid, but it's the hid singular, right? The English, you can't tell from the English. The Hebrew is important here because the Hebrew, you can tell, plural, singular. And so God is calling to the person, to the man. It says in the text, God's only talking to the man. Where are you? 10. Vayomer et kolcha shamati bagan. Va'ira ki erom anochi va'echave. So he said, Adam says back, I heard your sound, or I heard your voice in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, and I hid. But he's not naked. He just put on a fig outfit. 11. Vayomer mihi gid lacha ki erom ata. Who told you you're naked? Okay, fascinating that God says this. God doesn't say, why are you hiding? Or, what are you afraid of? He says, who told you you're naked? Okay. Hamin ha'etz asher tziviticha levilti achol mimenu achalta. Could it be that you ate from the tree that I commanded that I commanded you not to eat from it? You ate from it. So, in other words, asking a very specific question here. Little boy, or my son, like imagine a father saying to his son, a young son, a toddler, did you eat from that plate that I told you not to eat from? And you see chocolate all around his face. Okay, that kind of thing. But that man is wearing fig outfit. It's clear to God that how did he know? How did God know? How did the man know he's naked? Of course he ate from the tree. So God's given him an out. Did you eat from the tree I told you not to eat from? 12. Vayomer ha'adam ha'isha asher natata imadi hi natnali mina eitz va'ochel. So what does the man say? He could say, yes, I ate from it. Yes, I'm sorry, God, I ate from the tree. I couldn't help myself. Now, what does he say? He puts the blame. The man said, the woman that you gave me, I didn't want anything to do with her. You gave her to me. So if you're upset with me for eating from the tree, it's your fault because you made her. I had nothing to do with her. The woman that you gave me to be with me, she gave it to me from the tree, and I ate. Right? It's interesting how Adam. So another thing that the story does is get to the heart of how it's so hard for people to admit that they're wrong. So hard for people to admit that they're wrong. And it goes right back to this story. So another thing, so we don't have the time to finish the story. We learn from the story lots of things. Why is it that woman is going to labor in childbirth? It's because of this story. It says it at the end. Why do snakes slither on the ground? It's because of this story. Snakes used to have feet. Now they don't have feet anymore because of this story. Why is man going to have to labor for their livelihood? Because of this story. So that's how this story comes to explain the human condition. Whenever this story was written, man had to toil in order to make a living. Woman was in hard labor in giving birth, and snakes slither on the ground. And other things, more deeper things about human being. We blame other people instead of taking the blame ourselves. Right? So, it carried forward to the nth degree when Hitler blames the Jews for the problems of Germany after World War I. Of course, Hitler was wrong in doing that, but the model for blaming somebody else is from the Bible. So if it's in the Bible that Adam blames Eve for his problems, why? The story could have been written in a different way. Wouldn't it have been a more beautiful story if Adam says, God, you're right. I was wrong. And that he didn't blame the woman, and that God then would have had to go to the woman and say to her, why are you wearing clothes? Did you eat from how do you know that you're naked? Did you eat the tree? So it would have been a lot better. and perhaps better for humanity if the story was written that way. And then we wouldn't have learned that it's okay to blame somebody else for our problems. So I'm just saying that it leaves us with a lot more questions, that the way the story was written also teaches us about the nature of humanity today. Okay? And that the point of the story is to teach us about the human condition. The way the story was written also teaches about the human condition. Okay, so let me just clarify that even a little bit further. The Torah, if we understand the Torah is being written by God, then God wants to teach us something about the human condition. And that it was written on purpose that these things happen in the story this way. What I'm saying is that it's not written by God, and that the author of the story, or how the story was edited over time, it teaches us something about the human condition. We shouldn't blame God that it's our fault this way, but we should blame ourselves for learning things about the human condition and not saying that it's wrong to blame somebody else instead of acknowledging our own faults and standing up for it. Okay? So, a lot more could be said about the story. It's a fascinating story. Have a good rest of the day. Enjoy the end of the holiday season. Shmini Atzeret Simchat Torah and Shabbat Shalom too. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.